Let's dive into it.
I'm ready, I hope.
So I've read through the book. I've marked it up. I have some questions before I let others have it.
Fair enough.
The Twin Cities are a major financial services center in the United States. And I suspect that there are people here tonight who are involved in...
I've met some.
You've met some of them, right. Maybe I'm not seeing this entirely correctly, but it seemed to me you're a little hard on the vocation of finance, the person who makes their money by moving money, the biblical hard master who reaps where he does not sow. Am I seeing that correctly, or do I smell something in there?
Well, no, okay, so that's a great question. I'm not against the vocation at all. In fact, I want to see more Christians in finance. I think we need more Christians in finance. But I am very critical of the mechanism, and I'm very, very critical of how the mechanism is being manipulated. So most people don't understand how money comes into the system, and especially in a fiat system. But it's built on mountains and mountains of debt. And we have over-monetized, in my opinion, and the opinion of many, we have over-monetized the system, and in doing so, increased the debt burden for those least likely to sustain it, and made the rich even richer. I have a problem with that. So I'll just give you a simple statistic to chew on. In 1944, when the Bretton Woods Conference was held toward the end of World War II, and all the nations of the world got together in order to determine what monetary policy would look like the world over, and what the means of exchange for international settlements would be the world over. At that time, the United States was the world's largest creditor nation. In other words, we lent more to other nations than anyone else. And we possessed 3/4 of all the world's monetary gold, and the whole financial system was pegged to gold. Today, and importantly, since the Nixon shock of 1971, when we went off the gold standard and went to a purely fiat system, today the United States is the world's largest debtor nation, which means we borrow more than anybody else. And all of the gold in Fort Knox would only pay the interest on our national debt for about 6 months. This is a problem. And what we're seeing is, in a sense, a divorce from wealth and money. Money is supposed to be a means of exchange and a representation of wealth. But if you have a system where we continually monetize, and the amount of churn that is taking place, especially on Wall Street, that isn't adding any real value other than making the people who are doing the churn very rich, you're going to continue to exacerbate this problem. So I think we have really systemic issues that are ultimately moral issues in the financial sector. But I'm not hard on the vocation, because we need Christians in the vocation, but they need to have a prophetic voice. And I'll warn you now, it's hard.
So last night, James Harden scored 26 points and led the Houston Rockets to advance them to the next level of the NBA playoffs. Now, Harden, when the long history of the game is written, he will be identified as an innovator who looked at a rule that said that a player can take 2 steps in the process of making a shot, and he decided to take those 2 steps in reverse, which the officials had never seen before. It was an innovation in the game. And I offer that because I think it can be argued that the American spirit of innovation, invention, entrepreneurism might be expressed as we will overpromise but deliver in time, or maybe more harshly, that we will play this margin between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And to what degree, in your opinion, is this artful management of risk versus an unbiblical handling of yes and no?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very complex one. So let me just try to distill it a little bit and say, that if we have to start manipulating the law in order to achieve our economic ends, we're lost. As I mentioned before, we defer to law and regulation when ethics fail. So we shouldn't be hiring people to find ways to push the law to an extreme, and then if we fail, we get tested, we're punished, who cares, we took the risk, we made money. And a lot of that happens. In fact, if you look at most of the corporate scandals, I have a lot about the scandals in the book. If you look at most of those corporate scandals, basically you had people who sat around a room ultimately and they made a cost-benefit analysis, a risk-reward analysis. And sometimes they made an economic decision and people's lives were at stake. So we've got to push back against that kind of entrepreneurial thinking. I always say, I like to hire entrepreneurs who work for me, but not in the accounting office. Bad place to have entrepreneurial people. But that said, one of the reasons why the American economy has worked so well traditionally is because of innovation. But innovation in product design, innovation in application, innovation in the development of new technologies. The last place we want innovation, in my opinion, is in accounting.
Yeah. So you took a shot at one of my heroes, one of my intellectual heroes, Milton Friedman.
Yep. Uncle Milt.
Uncle Milty, yeah. And I'm going to ask you, what is the social or moral responsibility of a corporation? And as Friedman might have asked, who are these angels that will define that for us?
So let me first say this about Friedman, for those of you who aren't economists. And I have a footnote to this effect in the book. I don't throw Friedman's economic system under the bus at all. What Friedman did was genius. Friedman looked at the global economy in the 50s and 60s, and he said, we have a glut of labor, we have a glut of resources, but we don't have enough money. So let's monetize the system better, and we'll create more wealth. And it worked. We're in a very different situation today. Now we have a shortage of labor, depleted resources, and an over-monetization of the economy. So it's a very different system. My problem with Friedman was in this, what I believe to be ethical egoism undergirding his understanding of morality. If you defer to the notion that the common good is nothing more than the accumulated effect of people looking after themselves, you misunderstand what morality is. And you misunderstand what ethics is. And that kind of ethical egoism is very popular. John Stuart Mill, Ayn Rand, etc. It's very popular, but it's not biblical by any stretch of the imagination. So to answer your question, what is the moral responsibility? I think it comes down to what we believe the purpose of business is. And the purpose of business, in my opinion, a biblically based purpose of business, is to promote human flourishing. So part of the problem we have is the fiduciary laws are based on this prejudice toward ethical egoism. So we treat the shareholder, in a sense, as the only agent that we need to be concerned about. When in fact, the way they do it in the UK, recently they changed the law on this, we have a stakeholder system. So that while investors have a position of primus inter pares, first among equals, they are still equals, and the responsibility of executives is to consider the economic and social impact of every decision on the whole chain of stakeholders. Because you can't have a successful business without good suppliers, without customers, without employees, without public services, without all of these things that we just take for granted. So the notion that all that matters is the interest of an investor is just a flawed philosophy. That's why I think Friedman's wrong.
So I think we both would agree that there are inarguably moral dimensions to all of this. But in a postmodern culture, who's to say? Mm-hmm. How does this work?
Great question. That's why I talk a lot about deferring to wisdom and common grace and the virtues, because they are universal. We have the Decalogue. But we don't need the Ten Commandments to know it's wrong to kill. We don't. Every human being knows it's wrong to kill. We have what Calvin referred to as the Imago Dei and the sensus divinitatis. The Imago Dei, the image of God, is implanted into all of our hearts. And we know the difference between right and wrong. Forget about postmodernity. Postmodernity criticizes absolute truth claims. It doesn't rule out the possibility of morality. Most postmodern people would say they believe very strongly in morality. They just don't tie it back to a particular objective truth claim. Fine. When it comes to things like the difference between right and wrong, the difference between being honest and dishonest, when it comes to how we apply these virtues to the marketplace, these are universal things. We shouldn't have to explain to someone that it's wrong to cheat, that it is wrong to lie, that it's wrong to fix the LIBOR rate, for instance, is one of a classic example that we recently saw. So we have a big education problem in this country and in the church that we need to have the courage to say we need to reinforce that which already exists, but it's already there. Here's the thing. Here's the thing about virtue. What Aristotle said, what Aquinas said, what every philosopher who's ever studied virtue ethics will say is that virtue is forged in the crucible of practice. In other words, if you don't practice virtue, you will lose virtue. In order to be virtuous, you must do virtuous things. That's how you become a virtuous person. So we need to change the narrative from this selfish, ethical egoism, total moral relativism. We need to change the narrative. We should confront postmodernity in terms of its moral relativism, because in fact it's an intellectual conceit. Even the postmodernists know that there are certain universal truths, and honest dealing is one of them.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Decalogue, and you write in the book that the Decalogue and the cardinal virtues and their subsidiary virtues have been at the heart of Western ethical and legal thinking for centuries. How would you respond to the characterization that such a view is white, privileged, or supremacist?
Well, it's very easy to bandy about those terms, and I think it's unfortunate that every reference to historical fact is somehow viewed as an aberration of history. It's not. The facts are very clear. Western civilization was built on these things. That doesn't mean there weren't other voices informing the culture. There were, and there still are. So when we say that, it's not at the exclusion of other influences, not at all. But it's a recognition of the dominance of the Judeo-Christian tradition. You would have to be completely ignorant of Western history to not know that. You would have to have literally no knowledge of the Renaissance. You would have to have no knowledge of the High Middle Ages. You would have to have no knowledge of the Reformation in order to make a claim that there was anything regarding white privilege in that statement. Now, that said, if I hear someone say that, that tells me that person is hurting in some way. So I need to listen to that. And I need to respond to that with grace. So I can sit in a room of mostly, if not all, white privileged people and say that we shouldn't be defensive about it, but we should be sensitive to it. Being sensitive to it is not the same as being defensive about it, right? We can stick to our claims, but in a gracious way, in a loving way. And I actually had a student say to me once after I preached in chapel, the student came to me and said, "Your sermon is because of your white privilege." And the next thing they said was, "You don't understand what it's like for the international students." I said, "Really? Are you sure of that? Are you sure that I'm not an immigrant? Are you sure my father wasn't an immigrant? Are you sure that my father's name wasn't Francesco Giuseppe Mario Bottini and he changed it to Frank Barnes, and my name sounds like a white privileged name, but it's a very ethnic name? Are you sure that I didn't have to take a test to be given the privilege to vote in the country I chose to live in? Are you sure that I come from white privilege? And his response was, why didn't you ever tell anyone that story? And the answer is because I shouldn't have to tell anyone that story. Because we shouldn't presume that people are what we think they are because of their outward appearance. That in itself is a form of racism. So I think we need to listen very graciously and gently to that criticism, but I don't think we have to accept the criticism.
So tangential to that question would be, do you have a view of the relationship of the ascendancy of capitalism and the slave trade?
I think there's a lot of confusion about it. So one of the more common narratives we hear is that the wealth of the South was built on the backs of slave labor. In fact, slave labor held back the wealth creation in the South. One of the brilliant ideas that Adam Smith wrote about, and which was used by Wilberforce and others on the floor of the Parliament in England when they abolished slavery, is that slavery, counterintuitively, it actually has a negative impact on economic wealth and growth. And here's why. While it appears to be economically advantageous because you don't pay for the labor in wage terms, you actually are stifling your own future markets. In fact, he went so far, Adam Smith went so far as to argue in favor of what we today call the living wage. Not the minimum wage, the living wage. Adam Smith said if you want economic growth, you should make sure that everybody who works gets paid more than is necessary for subsistence. So slavery is a negative economic driver, not a positive economic driver. So there is confusion about the economic effect of slavery in the wealth creation in the South. Now, that said, again, there is no excuse for slavery, and there is no excuse for what has come after it in perpetuating really an apartheid system in many parts of this country. That's an issue we've got to address.
So let's linger with Adam Smith for a little while. I have had the privilege this semester of teaching our undergraduates on the Scottish Enlightenment, so I have read both the Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations recently. They're fresh in my mind.
Good.
You probably are familiar with James Boswell's characterization of Smith as an infidel in a bag wig. That for all the generosity you've shown him in terms of the Calvinist influences on his thinking, he would probably be more credited as an Enlightenment theist and the progenitor of a view that we derive much of our sense of virtue from each other socially. So what good comes out of that, and as Christians, what comes out of that ought to still give us pause and concern?
Well, so you raise a good point. He was an Enlightenment theist, which is more generous than some people give him credit for, because they paint him with the same brush as David Hume, who was an atheist, and that's not fair. In fact, he would have thought of himself as a Christian. He rejected the metaphysical claims of the scriptures, and he's not alone in that. I mean, there's a long history of that, especially during the 17th and 18th century. In terms of his belief that we learn virtue from observing others, he would say that was one of the ways we learn virtue. He would believe very much in the sensus divinitatis. In fact, he comes right out and says, and I quote him in the book, he says, anyone who believes in the existence of a deity must believe that the primary goal of man is to emulate the deity in his benevolence. So I give him a lot of credit for that.
I think he said, I cannot contemplate anything more miserable than a fatherless world.
And there you go. Yeah. And he was a fatherless person, as you know.
Right. Yeah. So I'm working on some thinking and some writing about performance culture, And so, you've written about the guys at Lehman Brothers, and we both, in our business careers, have worked alongside these A-type executives. And I would observe that with many of them, I have a hard time discerning whether their motivation was greed or whether it wasn't putting points on the board in a performance culture and gaining the applause of men. Now, those are related species of pride, but I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
So I was having a conversation with some Christian faculty in Oxford, and I was lamenting the fact that students were so driven to success, and I found that success had become an idol. And one of the professors said to me, "That's because you spend too much time at the business school. Our students in the sciences aren't like that." I said, "Really?" I said, "What do they strive for?" He said, "Well, they want their papers published, and they want to get grants." I said, "Oh, success." So it's the same sin, different demon. So the argument about is it greed or is it performance or what is it? I think it's a vicious cycle that people use performance as a way of making themselves very rich, and the more wealthy they become, the more powerful they become. The more powerful become, the more the self-aggrandizement, which then drives them to do it more, and it becomes this constant desire to self-aggrandize through these things. When you read the history, this is so important. When you read the history of moral failure in business, the one common thing that always brings them down is hubris. Hubris gets them every time. And so is hubris greed? I think they're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. So David Bahnsen, I was talking earlier today, he's written a book called Crisis of Responsibility on the 2008 Financial Collapse. And the general premise of that book is there was more than enough blame to go around from Wall Street to Main Street. But among the culprits would be, in his view, overregulation of markets. What's your view on?
Yeah, I actually think
their dog
I think he's wrong. I think if anything it was underregulation of markets, because what happened is very simple. Whenever you have too much cash chasing too few assets, you get bubbles, because you get this ridiculous demand for product. Right? It goes back to the tulip crisis of the 17th century in Holland. People become irrational, okay? And they want product. So what happens is very clever people create financial products without really testing them. And then they're thrust onto the market and people buy them up. And when people buy up these untested assets and they don't work, you get the crisis that we had. And the CDOs, the collateralized debt obligations, the derivatives that were built primarily, but not exclusively, on mortgage debt, which was itself driven by mortgages that were given to people that had no income, no job, no assets, so-called ninja mortgages, were bound to fail. But because there was such a desire for these products in the market, because of too much cash that couldn't lay dormant, what these smart people did was they took the bad loans and they bundled them with good loans, hoping that the good loans would mitigate the risk of the bad loans. The exact opposite happened. The bad loans contaminated the good loans. So when people started to default on their mortgages, the whole thing came down like a house of cards. I don't see how anyone can say too much regulation caused that.
Yeah. So you are the chair of a professorate in workplace theology, which is, I'm going to suppose has something to do with work. You've written about that in the book, and the Christian tradition about work and about hard work. Last year we had a guest lecturer from Colorado Christian who talked to us about that concept and how one of the fruits of capitalism is that we frankly don't have to work as hard for the subsistence things. When you talk about wealth, the subsistence package of food, clothing, medical care, shelter, as we did 100 years ago. And his example was how hard you had to work for a chicken in 1900 compared to today. What do you think about what is the idea of hard work in an even more automated and trending towards artificial intelligence economy?
Okay. So I teach a doctoral program in this very area on the future of work and the relationship between artificial intelligence and robotics in work, and the impact on global finance and access to capital, and also the environmental impact of all three of those things. And what I've concluded is we need to have a broader understanding of what we mean by work, because work has to be more than employment. And that makes sense if you think of the biblical definition of work. Because the biblical definition of work is doing anything that involves a reflection of God's nature and character with the faculties he has endowed us with. That is work. So as we need to do less of that for the purposes of subsistence, one of two options is going to happen. Either people will no longer have to work because there'll be a universal income or something of that nature, because technology will make human labor obsolete, and we will end up with a kind of Brave New World dystopia where everyone self-medicates and becomes nihilistic and the whole thing goes to pot. Or if the church has a place at the table, which is what I'm trying to encourage through this doctoral program, is we will see this as the single greatest opportunity in human history to harness human work and ingenuity and creativity for non-substantive things. So for human flourishing, arts, culture, nurture, all kinds of things that reflect the nature and the character of God, but have nothing to do with putting food on the table. I think that's an exciting prospect. And here's the thing. If the church isn't at the table, we're not going to like what fills the void. For the same reason that the church wasn't at the table in the Industrial Revolution, and Marxism filled the void. The church needs to be at the table.
This will be my last question, and then we're going to open it up. So if those of you who have questions want to start queuing up so we can move right into that.
There's two microphones, I think. Yep.
Yeah, there's two microphones. Let me, bankruptcy was once an acknowledgement of failure and is today a business strategy. In your theology of capitalism and the marketplace, is there any role for the kind of shame we might have previously felt about walking away from promises that we've made to pay our bills?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to motives of the heart. So bankruptcy is part of our system, just like the limited liability model is part of our system. It reduces risk, which encourages people to invest. And if you don't want to encourage risk taking, you're not going to have as much investment. So we allow for the fact that a certain number of businesses are going to fail. We know that. So bankruptcy in and of itself is not immoral, but a cavalier attitude to bankruptcy is. Bankruptcy should be a last resort, and it should be something that a person has no other option but declare bankruptcy. What has happened, as you mentioned, is it's simply become a strategic tool. We're just going to shut down, put a new shingle up tomorrow, do business as this new entity, and we're going to cheat our suppliers. To me, that is just grossly immoral. So this is one of the areas where regulation and legislation can come into play, where we start making it so that people have a bigger price to pay, and there are certain limits to what they can do afterwards if they do go into bankruptcy. You don't want to make it like it is in the UK, where it's ontological. You are a bankrupt. Not you went bankrupt. You are a bankrupt. You don't want that, because that just turns people off taking risks. But you don't want the cavalier system we have today. So I think that's one area, again, where the church can step up. And one of the things, by the way, that the Hebrew community did beautifully, which the church doesn't do well at all. And that is, the Hebrew community would rally around fellow members of the community when they were in financial need, to keep them from going bankrupt without expectation of return. I would like to see the church do more of that. I would like to see the church rally around people in our communities when they're in economic difficulty without expectation of return in order to help that person, because there is a shame issue, there's a dignity issue, and there's an honesty issue. So that's an opportunity for the church.
All right. So we got a question over here.
Great questions, by the way. Amazing questions. I think we should thank Rick for those questions.
All right, so I've been looking at Luke 16 for a while, and I'm wondering...
Luke 16?
Luke 16. Yeah,
One of my
this is
favorite passages.
Right after the unjust steward is commended. I'm wanting your input on verse 9 and 12 specifically. I'm going to start with 12. That's my more important one. It says, "If you have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own?" Now, growing up, I learned about money, dealing with my own money first, not someone else's. And so the way it's worded here sounds backwards to me, and I'm wanting maybe some insight as to why that's backwards, because I'm not figuring that out.
Okay. If you don't mind me, I'm going to stand by
Good question. Good question.
I think this is one of the most misinterpreted passages in all of Scripture. And I'll tell you how I read that entire story of the unjust steward. Some people say, boy, Jesus is really being pragmatic here. You know, he's kind of commending this bad guy, etc. No. In my opinion, Jesus is being ironic. When I was a kid, if my father saw me sitting on the stoop in New York with the bad guys, my father would say to me, "You like hanging out with those guys? Good, hang out with them. And you'll spend 20 to 30 years with them." I knew what he meant. So when Jesus says in this passage, "Oh, yeah, do what the people of the world do, and you'll spend eternity with them." Where do the wicked spend eternity? Not in heaven. I think Jesus is being genuinely ironic here. And in terms of the stewardship, you can't be trusted unless you can be trusted with little things, right? It's just good common sense economics. One of the problems we have is that we have a system which entrusts people with huge amounts of money before they have been given the opportunity to prove that they can be good stewards with small amounts of money. So I don't think it's even a question of whether it's my money or your money, because frankly, all money is everybody's money. I hate to tell you that. All money is everybody's money, because what do we say? Fiat money. It's all ours, if you know what I mean. We are all individual stewards of it, and ultimately, all belongs to God. All of it belongs to God. So I don't think there's an inconsistency there at all. I don't think it's backwards. I think it's a question of common sense advice that Jesus is giving his disciples and saying, look, and by the way, he's not even talking about money, right? He's talking about spiritual things, really, in the grander scheme of things, I think, in Luke 16, where he's saying, as stewards of the gospel, you need to walk, you need to crawl before you walk, you need to walk before you run. So that's how I interpret that passage.
So the 9, where he's saying, "Make for yourselves friends of mammon, of unrighteousness," I'm using King James, but you're saying that's an ironic statement.
I think he's being totally ironic there.
Okay, and then in verse 12, "Who shall give you that which is your own if you've not been faithful with another man's?"
Yeah. Well, he's talking about reward. He's talking about you will not get the reward you expect if you have been unfaithful in the little you've been given. So think about the logic of that from a spiritual standpoint, right? We want much from God, don't we? Right? And to whom much is given, much is expected. So we receive much from God, which means we are expected to be good stewards of all that he has given us, including in spiritual things. So I don't think it's backwards at all.
Let's come over here.
That's a great question, though.
Thank you. Devin.
Yep.
First, I want to thank you for the talk. I feel like you've clarified and integrated a lot of things that I have always thought and believed.
Great.
Grew up with a dad working in business development in the energy industry, taught me my first lessons in economics. I have his copy of The Wealth of Nations with his underlines and highlights.
Wow.
I've not read the whole thing yet. One day. But there's one point I do disagree with you on, and I'll say that this is an opinion that was sullied by J.D. Vance, wrote Hillbilly Elegy. He's a Yale-educated lawyer.
Yeah.
And he spoke to payday loans.
Yep.
And so I've considered it now from the business owner's perspective, as he's argued that it played a significant positive role in his life. And I'd like to present a couple of points, and I'd like you to point out why that doesn't work. So, as a business owner, I need to turn a profit on the product that I'm delivering to my customers. Now, a traditional bank is going to turn quite a hefty sum of money on my 30-year mortgage at 4 to 6%. But when my loan only has a term of a couple of weeks, how am I supposed to generate enough revenue to run a business?
There's no question in my mind that short-term debt is going to have a higher interest rate than long-term debt. Not 4,000%. Not 4,000%. And payday loans are targeted at people who can afford it the least. The person who takes out a payday loan is someone who can't come up with $200 for tires for the car, and they got to get to work. So they go to a payday loan, and they end up paying $450 for that $300 for those tires. I'm sorry, that's immoral on any level.
Would you present an alternative strategy for someone who's in that position?
I actually have a friend who started a bank just for that purpose. I write about it in the book, in fact. So you'll read about it in the book.
I'll add it to my nightstand.
No, well, if you buy my book, you'll see that part.
Right.
But this is important. He started a bank, and he crunched the numbers. And he found that if he charged less than 2% a month, it was insolvent, the bank. But that's all he charges. And it's designed specifically for people in the community. It's a community bank for people in the community so that they don't have to go to payday loans. Or even worse, in the UK, they have what's called doorstop lenders. And these are basically leg breakers that knock on the door. Need a loan, mate? No problem. Here you go. And they come back the next week, and if you don't have it, you're in trouble. So you know what they'll do? They'll lend you more until they own you. They literally own you. So you can do it. The models can be created with more interest than a normal loan, but nowhere near the kind of really usury that you see with payday loans.
Let me jump into that one for a second, because I actually hail from Butler County, Ohio, which was the county that J.D. Vance wrote about in Hillbilly Elegy. How would you respond to the argument that if you want to borrow money, there is always someone who will lend it to you, always someone who will lend it to you, and that without a somewhat regulated payday loan industry, you otherwise are turning the poor over to a truly criminal enterprise?
Yeah, I understand the logic of that. I don't buy it. To me, you might as well have the same argument for prostitution. If you're not married, you want to have sex, so you might as well have legal prostitution, otherwise you're going to go to illegal prostitution. Because for me, the payday loan, it's the moral equivalent. It really is.
Over here.
Hey, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks.
So you kind of have made the point that we should, I believe, and I'm paraphrasing what I think I heard you say, that society should embrace a win-win or a love-love approach to business. I think there's a lot of people out there who would say, I don't see that. What I see is a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. That all of business, all of capitalism is a zero-sum game. I don't necessarily believe that, but there's a lot of people that can make that do and can make that case.
So your
what's
question?
your thought? Yeah, what's your thought if we live in this world of zero sum? Mm-hmm. How do we approach society?
Okay, good, great question. It has become a zero-sum game, but it doesn't have to be, is my point. So I'll give you an example. The Mars Corporation. I don't know if any of you eat M&Ms or any of that, but most of you are probably customers of the Mars Corporation. The Mars Corporation a few years ago sat around the board table and they asked the question, getting back to temperance, how much is enough? Now can you imagine any corporation with the board sits around the table at the beginning of the fiscal year and asks the question, how much is enough? Because making candy is like printing money. I mean, it's just a high margin business and everybody buys it. And they came up with a number. And when they came up with the number, they looked at each other and they said, well, we all know we're going to make a heck of a lot more than that number. What are we going to do with that delta? Well, some would argue, well, make that money and then use philanthropy to give it away or something. They said, no. We have a chance to change the way we do business. And they called it the ethic of mutuality. And what they did is they said, let's go to our entire chain from some of the poorest communities in the world where they grow the cocoa, where they grow the sugar, etc., right up through our distributors to our biggest customers. And let's ensure that everybody in that chain gets that money. Let's figure out a way that we can share that wealth and we can ensure that everyone who's part of Mars flourishes. And we won't treat them like everyone else treats them, squeeze them for a penny, squeeze them for a penny, squeeze them for a penny. Let's figure out a way to do it differently. And they went to some of these communities in South America, for instance, where the cocoa is grown. And they said, we're going to do this. But they didn't just go to the farmer who they buy beans from. They went to the entire community and they said, yes, this farmer is going to make out great, but so is the rest of the community. Because this farmer is going to share with the rest of the community because that's part of our contract. Some of the extra money he's going to make because we've decided to do this, and you as a community are going to decide, are we going to provide women's health care, are we going to provide education, are we going to provide wells, are we going to provide sanitation, what are we going to do? And then the communities came together and figured it out. Well, guess what happened? Flourishing up and down the network, and they have the most loyal supply chain in the world. If Hershey's or anybody else went to those people and tried to make them a better deal, the people would say, no, thank you. So from a business standpoint, they did well by doing good. So
there must be something about chocolate because you may know that the Hershey Company, similarly, the majority of the stock held in the Hershey Company is in the Hershey Trust.
Yeah.
And those trustees are obligated by its charter that in any proposal that they consider, they're to vote only on the question, is it good for the citizens of Hershey, Pennsylvania?
And Cadbury did the same thing in the UK. Cadbury Chocolate Company. So yeah, maybe we should all be in chocolate.
Chocolate is virtuous.
Okay.
Your turn.
Yes. Oh, which side are we on? I'm sorry.
Yep. Speaking to men and women of the church, how do we get a place at the table that you talk about, specifically as business people and finance people?
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much for asking that. The first thing is we need to take care of this illiteracy problem. So we need to be up to speed. I don't expect people to be fluent in economics. I'm not fluent in economics. I'm not an economist. I'm a moral philosopher like Adam Smith. I'm not an economist. I'm an economist in the sense that I ran businesses. I created a lot of wealth. But I'm not technically an economist. But we need to have enough fluency so that we can have an intellectual discussion and understand somewhat what we're talking about. So that means it's going to take a little effort. But as churches, we can do this. We can bring in experts who can teach our people. There's nothing wrong with saying that we're going to have an adult education class on economics. I think that's a great idea, especially if it's done from a biblical perspective. I went up to Maine back in November, and a pastor in Maine on the 1 mile from the border of Canada, he has 2 little churches. He got both his churches to read the book, and then I came up for a weekend and did a weekend conference. It blew my mind. So part of it, we have to overcome the literacy thing. The second thing is, we shouldn't be timid in insisting on a place at the table, because we are stakeholders too. And it's not a question of church and state. We're not trying to impose doctrine on anyone. That's why I always keep deferring to the common grace stuff, all right? No reasonable person can object to virtue. Really, no reasonable person. So we need to do those 2 things, not be shy and make sure we know what we're talking about. Great question.
Over here.
Yes.
What's the proper role of capitalism in regards to health insurance?
Okay, I knew someone was going to ask this question. Okay, I'm just going to give you my opinion on this. And understand that my opinion is going to be viewed through the prism of someone who spent almost 25 years in a country where they have a national health service, okay, in the UK. The health care that my wife and I received in the UK was outstanding health care. Outstanding. And everyone in the country gets it. We pay for it through our taxes, and everything is provided. You don't pay a penny at the point of service at all. That is quite liberating for people. And by the way, because of that, they spend a lot of time and effort on preventative care because they want to keep the cost down, right? So some people would say, oh, that's socialism. It's not. In fact, the UK has one of the strongest economies in the world in the health sciences. Some of the most expensive equipment, most technological equipment, some of the biggest drug companies all operate in the UK. And parallel to the National Health Service is a private market. If a person chooses, in addition to the health service, to have insurance and use a private hospital, a private doctor, they can. And the NHS says, do it, because that will take some of the stress off our system. So I don't think it's an either or. I think a blended system works because I've seen a blended system work. So that then brings us to the economics of it, before we talk about the morality of it. The cost per person, per capita in the UK for healthcare, universal healthcare, $3,900 US per person. In this country, it's $11,000 per person. And we don't get better results. If we got better results in this country, I would say we pay more, but we get better results. But from the standpoint of pure economics, it's lunacy to pay 2.5 times more for something if you're not getting better results. So that brings the question, why isn't our system working? Now, I think there are 2 reasons. One, it's not really a market system. It's a cartel. If you don't believe me, try calling 4 hospitals and ask them to give you a quote for a knee replacement. Not only won't they do it, they can't do it. Because all the pricing is built into these deals that are made before you ever walk into the hospital. And the second thing is what I mentioned earlier about what is the one thing markets need to work? That natural equilibrium between supply and demand. And the only mechanism for regulating that is pricing. But if we believe in the concept of universal health care, if we think it's something everyone needs, and there is no correlation between your need and your ability to pay, how can we expect the market to fix that? You can do it, but not efficiently. So we have an inefficient healthcare system. Now, how we fix that is a different story. I will just say this. The Christian place in this debate is that we should be the voice of reason. We should be the voice of common good. And we should say to our politicians, to our thought leaders, this is something, if there's nothing else that needs bipartisan solving, it's this. So as Christians, we should be, I think, saying, we're not going to take sides. We're not going to go into our tribes. We aren't even going to use the word capitalism or use the word socialism. We're going to ask ourselves, how do we handle this big issue in the most efficient way? I think that's the best place for the church, is to be honest brokers. Now, that's just my opinion. And we could talk all night about why you think I'm wrong, and that's fine. But I'm just telling you that I honestly think being in the position of honest broker is the best thing the church can do.
What if you broke up the cartel and blew out all of the intermediaries between the provider of service and the consumers of service? Might the markets still perform well in that scenario?
I don't think so, but it's something that needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
And the point is, nobody wants to look at it without getting into their tribes. And this is where...
Doc on Gunsmoke seemed to work pretty well.
Let me tell you something. The biggest shock to my system moving back to America after 25 years, 23 years abroad was the political discourse in this country was something I didn't recognize. I looked at my wife and I said, what happened while we were gone? I never saw such vitriol and lack of humility and lack of grace, and we can do better. Yeah. We can do better, and I think the church should be setting an example. That's just my opinion. I'm going to go off my soapbox now, because I do everything I can to be apolitical.
Yeah. Over here, I think.
Oh, whose turn? Sorry. How many more can we take?
A couple more.
Okay, take these 4?
Yep.
Okay, take these 4. Yeah.
Yes, starting in the early 1990s, American corporations were attracted to doing business in China, manufacturing in China, in basically a non-market authoritarian system of government. And they also enjoyed the benefit of that lower cost of production. Yeah. So my question is, were the American corporations acting in a virtuous manner, engaging in manufacturing under a non-market or authoritarian government?
Mm-hmm. This is a very, very complex question, and I did a lot of business in China, as I did all over the world. We don't get to pick other people's governments. One of the ethical decisions that people have to make when they're faced with that is, what is the probability of reforming a totalitarian government if we close them out versus if we engage. And the general opinion is that the two systems that are currently operating in China are not sustainable together for much longer. Something is going to give. I don't think capitalism is what's going to give. I think the totalitarian government is what's going to give. Why? Because I've seen what happens when capitalism creates wealth and people begin to flourish. There are now 200 million middle-class Chinese. Mm-hmm. They are not going to put up with a totalitarian government forever. So, you could argue on one hand, we shouldn't have gone into the devil's playground. Or you could say, we went into the crucible in order to bring effective change. And if the result is that we can break the back of that totalitarian regime, because they will soon realize that capitalism works best in a non-totalitarian environment, in a free democracy, then will it have been worth it to do that? I think so. Now, you and I both know most companies didn't go in there with those, those motives. Most companies went in and they saw cheap labor. But you know what? That lasted about a minute in the overall scheme of things. Because once you started doing business there and they became part of your supply chain, you had to ensure that they were making products at a level that your home customers would accept. Which meant the labor thing changed immediately. The cheap labor thing went away. In fact, I've got a group of students, I'm taking 13 students to China in a few weeks. And I'm taking them to visit the manufacturing facility in Shanghai of a US multinational. Do you know what they're going to see? Exactly what they would see if I took them to Michigan to the factory there. They're going to see the most state-of-the-art equipment, the best health and safety, etc. Because the days of, barefoot cheap labor are gone in China. So it's an interesting moral dilemma, but the more time I spend in ethics, the more I realize most of these things are gray, not black or white. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that was just my experience doing business in China.
Let's come over here.
Yeah. So earlier in the dinner, you asked, the hot topic. What's the hot topic amongst the peers? And my peers is democratic socialism, mm-hmm. And some of my family who are really spearheading that conversation with on the democratic socialism side, they bring it up because they think they propose it as a solution to some of the issues we see today, healthcare and poverty and rich. And sometimes I find myself when I talk about capitalism not knowing knowing that we're all sinners and we're not going to reach a utopia until Jesus comes back. What is acceptable the bad threshold, what is okay to live with, like this is the system that until God comes back, this is what we can do, this is the best we can do. I struggle with knowing what capitalism can fix, and how good we can live with that system. So I'm just wondering.
Well, I think that's a great question, and I'm just going to take you back to what I said before. The things that the free market does, we should let it do. That's capitalism, folks. We should let the free market do what the free market does. But we should recognize those areas where it's not efficient. Then the question becomes, how much do we defer to the collective and why, and how are you going to pay for it? And one of the problems with most of the utopian solutions that I've seen is that they defer to a progressive tax system that is so high at the top that it creates capital flight and starts to reduce the ability to create wealth. So you throw the baby out with the bathwater. The trick is to find that balance. Many people have asked me, they say, well, Ken, what's your opinion of the tax system? Are you saying that we should tax the rich more? I'm saying no. Our rates aren't the problem. It's the complexity of our system that's the problem, and the fact that nobody pays the rates. And the higher you go, the less you pay of your rate. The whole thing with the tax breaks for corporations in 2017, you all heard the argument, right? America's nominal tax rate is 35%, Germany's is 18%. We can't be competitive, so we have to lower our... That is the biggest bunch of nonsense. I'm telling you as a guy who did business over there, okay? The Germans pay 18%, and so do we. Because we have so many layers of credits and deductions and things that the Germans don't allow their companies to take. A German company can fill out its taxes on one sheet of paper. Ours need lawyers to figure out things that... It's just, we have too much complexity in the system. What I would rather see is a simple progressive system that never goes above 45% at the highest level, but throughout that strata, you take out all of the complexity, and people pay what they're supposed to pay at that level. The United States, by the way, is the only country in the world that requires its citizens to file taxes when they're living abroad. So I had to file taxes in 2 countries for 23 years. 5 minutes to do my UK taxes. 5 minutes. To do my US taxes, oh my goodness, forget about it. Yeah, the accountants would give me this book, this thick. And I'm not a corporation. I'm not that complicated. But that's the problem with our system. So I think it's a question of degree and getting rid of the labels. Like I said, social democracy, or democratic socialism really isn't even socialism. It's just the collective. Who's
Over
turn?
here.
Over here, thank you.
Next to last.
Would you please comment on the future of capitalism in light of the perceived or real threat of global warming?
Yeah, okay. So, forgive me if I offend anyone here, but I think climate change denial is so self-defeating. I, again, have done business all over the world. I have personally seen the impact of economic activity on the environment. What has happened to this environment in the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution would normally take 10 to 20,000 years through normal geological cycles. You have to torture the data not to conclude that economic activity is having a negative and potentially catastrophic impact on our environment. So, what do you do about it? Let me tell you what you do about it. You let the market figure it out. And I'll give you a real example from my own life. So I was in paint. Paint is a very complex product to make, believe it or not, really hard to make. And the European Union decided in 1991, 1992, that no more solvents would be allowed in paint. Well, every paint that every manufacturer made was built on solvents. So what did we do? We got together as an industry and we went to the European Union and said, we can't do it. Do you know what the European Union said? Figure it out. So guess what happened? We went back to our boardrooms and back to our laboratories and we said, the first company to figure this out is really going to do well. And we figured it out. And guess what happened? We got rid of the solvents and all of the environmental degradation involved in the solvents. And we produced a product that actually went better onto the surfaces that it was being painted on, cost us a fraction to make because water's a lot cheaper than solvents, so our margins went through the roof, and from a health and safety standpoint, it was safer environment for the people who were applying it. There were no losers, there were only winners. Not because the government said, here's what you have to make from now on, but because the government said, you can't do this anymore, figure it out. And the market figured it out. So I think if we would just let the market go, and instead of denying that there's a problem, admit that there's a problem. And then say to industry, figure it out. We want no carbon emissions for energy or whatever by a certain year. You know what'll happen? We'll create more wealth than you ever imagined, and the environment will benefit. That's been my experience.
Given that we're just a little bit over time, could I ask that, maybe hope that your question is at least inside the margin of the elimination of human depravity, just to the amount of time we have left.
Well, I'll make it short, certainly, and I'll make it...
I think he's saying that my answers are the problem.
Oh, it's going to be your answers, not the questions? Okay.
Well, you guys ask tough questions.
So I have a question on a practical level about personal finance investing. So based on your premise on capitalism and the current state of capitalism, what's the moral standing in terms of investing in index funds?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't have a moral position on that because I think that's an individual decision that everyone has to make. Most people don't have the economic bandwidth to invest in individual stocks. So an index fund is as good as any other fund. The fact of the matter is, to say that you shouldn't do that because of the problems in the system would be like saying you shouldn't carry this around. You got to carry this around. That's the system, right? You have to be pragmatic about this. That's the system. So I don't personally think that's a problem. So it's a good question, but I don't want you to get out of your 401ks or anything else, because capitalism works. That's the bottom line here. Capitalism works. And the good it's done in terms of wealth creation, bringing people out of poverty, health standards, education standards, I mean, I could go on, is unprecedented. But the bad and the ugly isn't the price we have to pay. Thank you.
So, as a theologian, you'll appreciate that here at Bethlehem, we have a lot of affection for Jonathan Edwards, and so we will spend a lot of time thinking about the emanation of God's glory and the remanation of that glory in the good things that we see in the earth and the excellence that we see in things. And so when we think of work that is done to the glory of God, it is reflective of His own excellence. And so let me just say on behalf of everyone here tonight, excellent, excellent work.
It's been my pleasure. Did this gentleman have one last question?
I'm sorry I was in the aisle when you tried to close this, so I guess I have this question. And by the way, I think one of the interesting aspects of the problem with capitalism also pertains to the problems with democracy, because you'll remember John Adams said that you can't have democracy unless you have a virtuous population. But anyway, here's my question. Can capitalism fix a $22 trillion debt, which is growing?
The answer is not in its current form. We didn't have a chance to talk about debt tonight, really, but the $22 trillion and growing national debt and the $14 trillion and growing personal debt that is being held by people in this country, to me, is the single most serious existential threat to our culture and civilization that there is. I just don't think it's sustainable. And I'll just leave you with this thought. Sorry, Rick, I gotta finish this thought. I'll leave you with this thought. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, we have had approximately 2.5% annual GDP growth. That comes to about $4 trillion in wealth creation in that 10-year period. Over the same period, we have added $12 trillion to our national debt and put another $4 trillion of debt-laden quantitative easing into the system. That's $16 trillion. So it cost America Inc.'s balance sheet $16 trillion in order to get $4 trillion on our P&L account. Any business that did that would be out of business. Amen. So I'll leave it with that. Amen.
So I know you want to sign some books, and some others want to have you sign them. Again, let's express our appreciation to Dr. Kenneth.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for the evidence of your presence and your glory here. We have seen your excellence and your glory reflected in the excellent work of Dr. Barnes tonight. We pray your blessing upon his work and on his ministry, and particularly as we come into a season where these issues will be before all of us, we pray that you will go with him and give him traveler's mercies home in the morning, and give traveler's mercies to our guests here tonight, that they would all get home safely as well. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all for coming.